Hi as well. I'm Mr. Romani. I'll be doing some of your online lessons during school closure. I'm probably teaching some of you next year as well. So I teach sociology at Goffs with Mr. Bora and Mr. Cahill. I know some of you won't have met me, which is why it's actually quite nice that we have this opportunity to meet in this way at least. So in terms of today's lesson, as you can see on my screen, okay, I'd like you to complete the worksheet that I've attached as we go through the lesson. Okay, you can either edit the file or print it out or do notes on a separate piece of paper. Either of those options are fine. And at the end, I'm going to ask you to complete a 10-mark question for me and email it to myself at sdr@goffs.hearts.sch.uk. You can use that email to send any questions as well. And all of this is due on the 2nd of June, so the Tuesday after half term. Now in terms of sending the worksheet, that's up to you. I'm happy to read through it and give you some feedback, but it's not necessary for you to send that. My main focus is that 10-mark question. Okay, before we get started with the lesson, as you can see on my screen, okay, I've outlined the A-level exam structure in a table for you. I'd like you to just take a moment and pause this video and just read through each of the papers and what questions you'll come across, just to familiarise yourself with the exam structure. Okay, in terms of the unit that we're currently working on, the media, you've got 3 exam questions you'll be answering. Okay, you've got a 10-mark question, which is outline and explain. Okay, you've got another 10-mark question, which you haven't come across as of yet, and that is where you apply material from an item, okay, and analyse two aspects of something. So this is different to what you've done in AS, but actually I think it's quite a useful 10-marker because you've got that item that has hints in it as to what you can include in your answer. So it actually helps you a little bit to have that to refer to. And then you'll also have a 20-mark question, which you're already familiar with. Now, there's 6 topics in the media unit. You've started topic 1 with Mr. Bora, and that's the relationship between ownership and control. And with me today, you're going to start topic 3, which is the process of selection and presentation of the content of the news. Now, the other things, as you can see, that you'll be covering are globalization, representations of different groups, the relationship between media and audiences, and you're also going to look at the new media and how it impacts society today. In terms of today's specific lesson, okay, we're going to look at how news is selected to be presented. Okay, outside of today's lesson, we're going to look at moral panics and the impact of the new media, but today we are specifically focusing on how are specific news stories selected and why. So to start off with, okay, your first activity kind of comes up here, so it's just to fill the gaps based on the information on the screen here. Now, all sociologists argue that the news is socially constructed. They don't believe that it's a window on the world where you accurately see what's going on in the world. No, they argue that it's socially constructed. It's something that is created based on the results and decisions made by media professionals about what to include and how to present it. Okay, so if you think about it, a lot of things happen in the world and they are not reported and they don't appear in the news. Okay, you've also got to think in terms of what does appear in the news. It's structured and ordered in different ways based on what media professionals think is most important. Okay, and all this is because of decisions by media professionals, okay, and the owners of the media as well. Okay, so basically everything we see in the news reflects those involved in its creation. Now, McQuail is one of the key theorists that we're going to look at today, and he argues that news is socially manufactured. Okay, gatekeepers like editors and journalists decide what will be in the news. Okay, and that's based on 3 things: organizational or bureaucratic constraints, news values, ownership, ideology, and bias. Now, a key term I've already said is gatekeepers. Now, when we're talking about gatekeeping, it's the power of some groups or people or organisations to limit access to something useful. So when we're talking about the news, okay, and the mass media, we're talking about how people like editors and journalists have the power to refuse to cover certain issues, okay, by choosing to include some stories and not include others. They are not allowing the public access to some information. Okay, that's what gatekeeping is, and that's why they're gatekeepers. Imagine someone there opening the door, okay, or the gate, sorry, to certain news stories and then closing it to others. That's what we're talking about here. Now, the first factor that McQuail talked about is organisational or bureaucratic constraints. Okay, and that's where we're talking about logistical factors. Okay, there's a couple questions in your worksheet to answer here, so try and do that as you're watching. So there's 5 key things. Okay, you've got journalistic ethics. Now there are actually boards, okay, that monitor journalists to make sure that they're avoiding publishing inaccurate information and that they're respecting people's privacy. Now that's not necessarily always followed, okay, but the guidance is that journalists should avoid publishing inaccurate information and they should respect people's privacy and dignity. So in theory, that should limit what stories can be produced. There's also financial costs. So money is very important when it comes to news. So news companies will try and reduce costs as much as they can. So they might, for example, not send reporters overseas, which means stories from overseas will not be included. You've also got the audience. If your audience is very right-wing, and you're a right-wing newspaper, you're going to include stories that fit in with that. Okay, because the audience at the end of the day is the people buying your newspapers or clicking on your website and giving you, helping raise advertising revenue, for example. You've also got deadlines. So this obviously doesn't count for 24-hour news or news websites or social media. But in terms of newspapers, 10 o'clock the night before the newspaper is to be published generally is the cut-off time for adding anything to the newspaper, because obviously they have to get printed and distributed. So anything after 10 o'clock will not be included. You've also got the issue of time and space. So if we're talking about BBC News at 10 PM, for example, they've got about 25 minutes to cover things, and they, in that time, can talk about maybe 15, maybe slightly more issues. Okay, so it limits what they cover. So they have to, because of that, limit what news stories they consider to be important and talk about those and those only. In terms of news values, okay, this is another theorist, Spencer Thomas, someone you need to know about, so try and make note of that name or highlight it, okay, argues that news values are guidelines that help people like media professionals decide what is newsworthy and what isn't. So I've got on here 8 different news values. If a news story fits in with 5 of these news values, it's very likely to be included in a newspaper or news website. If it doesn't cover any of them, it's very unlikely to be included in newspapers or news websites. So have a little look. So we've got extraordinariness. So if it's an unexpected event, it will be probably included. If it refers to elite people or places, okay, it's more likely to be newsworthy. So we tend to hear more about, for example, America, European countries, okay, and less from third world countries. Okay, frequency. So if it's a story that develops quickly, it's more likely to be included. So if you think of the BBC Live stories where they've got like a stream of that gets updated like every 30 seconds, that sort of story is more likely to be included. And they prefer to write news like a story, so anything with a narrative are more likely to be included. We've also got threshold, so if it's a really big event, it's more likely to be included. So think of like the Manchester Arena bombing. It's a big event, okay, and so it's included. You've also got unambiguities as a news value. So if something is ambiguous, so if it's not black and white, if it's a bit confusing potentially, it's less likely to be included. If it's unambiguous, if it's really black and white and really straightforward as a story, it's more likely to be included. Now, you'd have noticed more recently that negativity in the news is very popular. Okay, so war, violence, death, and tragedy are the sorts of things that straight away are included in the news. But you've also got personalisation, so events associated with a certain person. So straight away, what comes to mind for me is during Brexit, Theresa May was associated with Brexit and its failure. Now that, to me, is an example of personalisation. Okay, so I'm going to ask you to pause here in just a moment, and for each news value that's on your worksheet, I want you to find a story that fits in to each news value. Now, you might use the same one for 2 or 3 news values, that's fine. So for negativity, for example, I'd say that the coverage of the coronavirus pandemic focuses on the number of deaths, and that's an example of negativity. So there was a massive story when we hit over 20,000 deaths, for example. When we became had some of the highest numbers in Europe. Okay, that is an example of negativity. Okay, so just pause it here and see if you can work that out and get some examples. Okay, now the last factor that we're going to look at today, okay, is ownership, ideology, and bias. Now again, you've got some questions in your worksheet to complete as we go through this. So in terms of ownership, Marxists argue that owners of different media content influence the content of their newspaper. So for example, Rupert Murdoch, which I know you've talked about with Sarah already, okay, obviously owns lots of news outlets. Okay, now during the Iraq War in 2003, his newspapers did not criticise the Iraq War in any way, shape or form. And this is because Rupert Murdoch was very for the Iraq War. So you can see how him being for it, okay, led to his newspapers not criticising it. So that's an example of how ownership, okay, will impact content chosen. Now, outside of that, okay, advertising can also affect what goes on the news and what doesn't. So if it's a news website that mainly gets its revenue from advertising, okay, it's not going to do anything to upset its advertisers. So, for example, okay, if they wanted to criticise capitalism and economic growth, that would put off the advert people. And so they wouldn't want to put their adverts on their news page anymore. Okay, so they can't do that because it's their revenue. There's also something called the hierarchy of credibility. Now, in terms of the hierarchy of credibility, it's something we're going to look at in more detail in kind of the lessons to come. But generally speaking, it argues as a theory that certain people are seen as more credible than others. And at the top of the list of credible people is the elite and the wealthy. Okay, and at the bottom is the poor. Okay, so generally speaking, when you look at the news, first up, what they'll bring as someone to talk about an issue will be someone who is wealthy and someone who is elite. They're brought on the screen as a specialist. Okay, and then after that, they will bring on radicals and critics, people that will criticize the elite and the wealthy. And they argue that because they bring on the elite and the wealthy first, okay, for the audience, they will see that elite, wealthy person's opinion as the norm. And then when critics and radicals come on afterwards, they are not seen as the norm. So in terms of how it's presented and what is presented first will impact what people think about a certain issue. Now, in terms of ideology, I think it's quite straightforward to think about. In terms of each news website, you know that they all have different ideological visions. Some might be left-wing, some might be right-wing, some might be centre, for example, on a basic level. Okay, so instantly that impacts how they will write a story and what stories they will write. Okay, so for example, okay, a very left-wing paper, the Morning Star, it's a communist paper really, okay, generally has stories that are very anti-government, okay, and so they will only have stories that are anti-government. They will not write a story about how Boris Johnson's doing an amazing job, because they do not believe that in their ideology. Okay? In terms of bias, though, I think a key statistic that really should stick in your head here is that most journalists are middle class and male. Now, this obviously has an impact on the news that is selected, because if over 50% of journalists are educated in private schools, and most come from a middle class background, they will have a certain middle class, arguably, view of the world. And so in terms of when they're choosing news stories to put in the news, okay, they will choose things that serve their interests. Okay, so they might not look, for example, at stories that talk about working class interests. Okay, so that will have an impact on what goes on in the news. Now, I know I've spoken quite quickly throughout this whole presentation, so if you do have any questions, okay, do email me at sdr@goffs.hearts.sch.uk. Now, I'm going to talk you through the 10-mark question that I've set you, just so you've got some clear guidance here and some help, because it's a new type of 10-mark question that you haven't come across before. So, on your screen, as you can see, okay, in the box, we've got item A, and it says, what counts as news is a social construction. It is largely media professionals who select which stories are to appear in the news. Both in broadcast and print media, a range of factors influence which stories journalists and editors select for inclusion in the news. And the question is, apply material from item A, analyse 2 factors that influence which stories are selected for inclusion. Now, in terms of advice for this, okay, obviously you'll follow the Penner structure as you do in all 10-mark questions, okay, so you'll have 2 Penner's paragraphs, so point, explain, name, example, significance, and you can see that I've got some sentence starters there to help you if you don't know how to word it. Okay, so you do that twice, okay, but in the second paragraph say a second factor influencing instead. Now, I believe, in terms of what I can see in the item, that you should write 1 Penner's paragraph about media professionals, because as you can see that I've highlighted, it says in the item it's largely media professionals who select which stories are to appear in the news. So that is what I'd use from the item in that specific Penner's paragraph, and I'd use probably McQuail, okay, as a theorist there, and an example from a recent news story. Okay, in terms of your second Penner's paragraph, I would write it about other factors like news values. Okay, so you can refer to Spencer Thomas as your theorist. Okay, and in terms of a quote from the item, I'd say a range of factors influence which stories journalists and editors select. Okay, so you need to refer to the item twice in your answer, once in each Penner's. Okay, so your first Penner's about media professionals and McQuail, and your second Penner's about Spencer Thomas, okay, and news values. And make sure that in each paragraph you use the item. If you don't use the item, you limit your marks in total. Okay, so if you don't use the item at all, you can only get 3 marks. So it's really worth you making sure that you include it in there. Now, if you've got any questions, feel free to email me. I hope that's quite straightforward. So remember to email your answer to sdr@goffs.hearts.sch.uk by the Tuesday after half term, so the 2nd of June. Okay, thank you very much. Have a good day.